Hello and welcome to Haxby and Wigginton Methodist Church. Well, welcome to my study. My name's Rory, I'm the minister of the church, and we continue well into September to be meeting online and meeting in ways other than physically in our building because of the realities of coronavirus now reasserting itself in the population, and as we wait for the winter to see what lies ahead for us, we do so with hope, but perhaps also with some anxiety. As I've said already, we gather as a congregation, for those who can and want to. We gather online twice a week on a Sunday morning and a Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock. And if you're interested in being part of either of those gatherings, which are informal and conversational and involve a mixture of music, chat and some reflections from Scripture with some prayers, you're very welcome to do so, and please be in touch if you need details of how to do that. But today, I'm recording on this Sunday, the 13th of September, a reflection on the Gospel reading and the Old Testament reading that are set for today, or the alternative Old Testament reading, because there's a second reading we can use. And today I want to touch on a very difficult subject, which is the subject of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a complex and painful topic for many people. It's not simple or easy in almost any direction, and I want to spend a little bit of time with it this morning without doing justice, I'm sure, to many of the situations that we or people in the world have found themselves in through all of history and right now, when it comes to the deep work of asking what it means to ask for or receive or offer, give, reach out with forgiveness to other people. So our readings for today are in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, and beyond the lineage story of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, we meet Joseph. Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, who became very wealthy and very prominent in Egypt, and who then saved his family from famine in Israel when they came calling. Right towards the end of Genesis, we read of the death of their father Jacob, and then we have a short section that precedes the death of Joseph himself. But from this far, realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crimes of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore please forgive the crime of your servants, of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So we don't know exactly how much longer Joseph lived. We know that he died aged 110, according to the verses that follow, and then right at the end, just a few verses left of the book of Genesis, we have the death of Joseph. And then turning to the Gospel today, we're in Matthew chapter 18, in a section of teaching, rich, deep and challenging teaching of Jesus. And we begin at verse 21. Then Peter came to him and said, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often shall I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, the one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him, and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves, who'd owed him a few hundred denarii, and seizing him by the throat, said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So we begin with Joseph. Joseph, who is the forgotten fourth line of a generation who are the hope of Israel, and through them, through the Bible story as we have it, the hope of the world. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. And as we pick up the story, certainly in terms of the way it's written, quite close to the death of Joseph, with not much happening afterwards anyway, before he dies, we have the story of who he has become through his suffering and his struggle and the vagaries of his life. And it's quite poignant that in the Christian faith and in the Jewish faith we talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and we leave Joseph out. Because actually in the way that each of them dies, in the people they have become, in the stories as we have them, of who they are as they die, Joseph deserves to be mentioned as well. Abraham dies after his wife Sarah, after he's taken another wife and fathered further children. But because Isaac is the chosen one, the special one, because God's promise to Abraham has been made real in the person of Isaac, even though before him he had children with concubines, with women who were there to provide children for him, because his wife could not offer him a child for some time, could not produce a child. For some reason, somehow, she wasn't able to do that. One of the very last things that Abraham does in all of the wonderful story of his life and his faith and his character is that he gives gifts to the sons of his concubines and sends them away. Sends his children away because they are not Isaac, because they are somewhere down the pecking order of his love and his fidelity and his faithfulness. Now, I don't want to give him too hard a time and judge him too strongly, because, of course, in the culture in which he lived and in the promise that he held, his succession was everything, and the promise was made to him and to Sarah, not to him and his concubines. But he essentially guarantees Isaac's security in terms of land and property and place by sending all his other sons away. And however we want to understand that, however we may have sympathy for the context of the story, that is a difficult thing to do, a difficult thing to understand a father doing to his children. And then we have Isaac. Isaac, who is tricked by his younger son, by Jacob, into giving the birthright that is due to his brother Esau, giving that to him. There's no reason why Isaac necessarily couldn't have said, "I have been tricked," and that these magic words once spoken can't be taken back. But the birthright, the blessing, the continuation of the blessing of the promise of God falls to Jacob, because Jacob tricks Isaac. And Isaac on his deathbed still seems to be at peace about that. Still seems to be unable to do anything about that. But we do see in both Esau and in Jacob real journeying through the story of their own lives. Jacob essentially in exile, running away for fear of his life, and Esau left behind to hold the fort with none of the power that was due to be his, none of the privilege, none of the headship. And when they meet each other, we meet in Jacob someone who has come to terms with what he's done, to the point where he's brutally honest with his brother and himself about not just what he's done, but what he deserves. And in Esau, we meet someone who doesn't even need Jacob to ask for forgiveness, but who simply wants to embrace his brother. Esau, who's done the work of forgiving his brother well in the time that they've been apart, so that when he sees him, he's overjoyed, and they embrace and they weep. And then there is Jacob, who, however he travels between that moment when he makes full confession to his brother and returns, and his own death, one of the last things he does in just the chapter before, the chapter we read, in Genesis 49, Jacob on his deathbed offers a blessing to his sons. Although some of those words are far from blessing. They're not even just words of, some of them, just words of honest disappointment and struggle with the characters of some of his sons. But they begin for the first three, certainly the second and third. They begin with words that are a curse, and are written as a curse upon his children. And six of the 12 get, at best, indifferent words from their father, at worst, a curse rather than a blessing. And then we meet Joseph who has his brothers come to him, Joseph who has his brothers openly lie to him, and he must know that they're doing that. You know? Dad said that you really should forgive us because that would be the right thing to do, and you wouldn't want to disappoint the memory of Dad, would you, essentially? What does he do? He weeps. And he weeps perhaps at their duplicity. He weeps at all that's gone before. He weeps at all that has been lost in the time that they haven't had. But he knows that somehow he has journeyed through his life in a way that feels like a blessing, and that he's been able to materially support his family and sustain them, and so he offers them his blessing and just says, you have nothing to worry about, you or your little ones. Just vignettes, just little windows on the state of the souls and the characters of these people, these men. And as I say, Joseph, I think, is an archetype amongst them. Joseph is one of probably the standout of those four, the standout early descendant of the promise that God makes to Abraham when it comes to his character and what he's done with his need to forgive and his understanding of his own place within God's blessed world. Peter comes to Jesus in the gospel and says, how many times? And Jesus says in our version 77 times, sometimes 70 times 7. Because of translation problems there, it's not clear what the original intent of the author was. But Jesus quite clearly just says, think of a number, make it even bigger, make it much bigger. This is not about forgiveness as a commodity, that forgiveness is not about accounting. Forgiveness is not about a reckoning of what is appropriate between one and another so that there might be peace between them. Forgiveness is a deep matter of the heart. It often begins with a decision. And that's why I began this reflection by saying that I'm very aware, out of my own life and the lives of people I've shared, never mind the life of South Africa, my home nation, and many, many other settings, that forgiveness is a complex, deep, painful, lengthy process that sometimes never finishes. But it is a deep matter of the heart, and in some ways goes to our character and our coming home to ourselves, so that we are able more and more to make room for other people, perhaps to still struggle with the depth of depravity or pain that is in them, or that we see in them, or that we see them causing to ourselves and others, but to make room for the possibility of forgiveness. Jesus, of course, uses hyperbole, and we see that again in the story himself. He says that the first slave comes owing 10,000 talents. And one of the commentaries I've used to think about today, one of the resource books I've gone to, suggests that 10,000 talents was the equivalent of a day's wage for a labourer at that time for 150,000 years. So of course Jesus is saying something outrageous about the scale of the debt. It can never be repaid. And when it is forgiven and the slave is released, the first servant doesn't seem to grasp what has happened. Even in his pleading, he says, I will pay you everything, even though it can never, ever possibly be paid. He still wants to engage with us, begs to be forgiven from within a framework of justice. It's not so much about being released from debt or having that debt somehow set aside in whole or in part. It's about the fact of justice needing to be done, and that simply being put off for a time by the fact of the promise to repay an impossible debt. The story is about human forgiveness being rooted in divine forgiveness. The story is about forgiveness being rooted in mercy, not justice. That forgiveness is, as much as we might struggle with notions of justice and punishment and for crimes and what constitutes suitable punishment, forgiveness is about mercy, not justice. Which is why it continues to astonish the world when people whose children have been murdered on the streets of this country or anywhere in the world because they were black, for example, or because for people who've experienced enormous atrocities. In South Africa's own story, any number of people, some of whom I heard give testimony in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings that I was attending, sitting in the gallery. People who could offer genuine forgiveness for those who had hurt them and their families so much, before there was any talk of justice, before there was even any need for that person to require justice. In one of the books that I've used, Texts for Preaching, thinking about today, this paragraph. How then does the passage address seriously injured persons? Persons battling with shame and alienation, caught up in issues of forgiveness as victims, as perpetrators. It portrays in a dramatic story the incredible kindness of God, who surprises people not by dealing with them on the scale of justice, even though they seek it, but by showing mercy. It invites readers to view themselves as forgiven debtors, no more, no less, living with and among fellow debtors. The difference between the debtors is only slight. To be forgiven means to give up the power game of playing innocent versus guilty, and to join a fellowship of forgiven sinners. None of this is easy. None of it is simple. None of it is straightforward. Forgiveness is probably some of the hardest work we ever get to do inside of ourselves as human beings in our relationships. And it often begins with the extent to which we view ourselves as people in need of forgiveness, or people who do or do not deserve forgiveness. We live with our secret selves, and we wonder whether that person is really lovable, acceptable, welcome. If only people knew the truth about us, perhaps, they might not be so happy to see us, to include us, to trust us. There is an unhealthy humility that has us putting ourselves down to the point where we do not have confidence in our belovedness, in our lovability, if that makes sense. Not just that we are loved, but that we are genuinely lovable by God or by anyone else, in whole or in part. But there is quite simply the fact of the story of Jesus on the cross at Easter, and we do view those events. We do view those events every year through all kinds of lenses that have justice at their heart and ask about the debt we owe to God and how Jesus might be paying that on the cross in some way, through the eyes of mercy that see this great act of participation in the deepest pain and struggles of the world by a God who does not remain distant and is affected and chooses to continue to be affected by our lives and by pain. We wrestle with Jesus forgiving people's sins before he dies on the cross, and then ask what Easter really means. But whatever it does mean, however we each understand it, at its heart is this message of forgiveness, of mercy, of a God whose heart is turned towards us, a God who is not waiting for us to prove ourselves worthy, but a God who comes in Jesus to show our worthiness to God, and to perhaps open up or highlight a pathway that has been there before, that was and is the hope of the world. Certainly the hope for you and I, that we can at least live peacefully with ourselves and with each other, and that where there is forgiving to do, that we do it well. I've conducted a number of funerals during this coronavirus time, and many, many more before that. And it remains true, and I said this at the last service that I conducted, none of us grows old and wise or beautiful by accident. We do that because we do the work of engaging with life. And we are good for the people around us, perhaps in most important ways. Not because our feelings of love are obviously shown towards them, but because we do the deep work of learning, as Joseph did through his suffering, as Esau did through his betrayal, as many other characters have done in the course of history, through the pain of their lives, through the betrayal that they've experienced, and through the things they need to forgive in others, never mind themselves. That we can become free enough to not want anything other than mercy for other people. Anything other than room to be included and welcome, however guarded and however much we still are learning to trust ourselves and them. That mercy trumps justice when it comes to forgiveness. If you have someone to forgive, if you have some forgiving work to do towards yourself, if you need to ask someone for forgiveness, I pray today that you will have the courage and the strength to do that work well, however slowly, but that you will be, as Joseph and Esau and others have been through all of history, growing up in the pain, as Jacob did in coming to terms with his betrayal, growing up into the realization of the consequences of what you and I have done with our lives and how that has affected other people. That we'll do that work really well. And that if the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, shown in the person of Jesus most clearly, helps us to do that, and these stories as we have them help us to realize that forgiveness is not an exercise in accounting. It's not primarily about justice. It is perhaps primarily about mercy. It is a deep matter of the heart that engages our minds and our memories and our stories and our history and our everything about us. But it is a deep matter of the heart, and a deep, deep place in which our character may grow. So yes, as we think about Easter each year, we interpret those events through the lenses of justice and mercy. And the way we do that shapes the nature of the God we believe in. A God who needs justice, or a God who offers mercy, or a God who does both in some way that needs reconciling and further thought. Most importantly, they shape the nature of what we think it means to be Christ-like, and Christ-like in our offering of forgiveness to others, in our living honestly with integrity, in our dealing with the hard things that life throws at us as they come, and in the forming of deep community where there is room for us all to be forgiven sinners. If you want to be in touch about anything that I've said today, if it's affected something of your memory and your story, and you want to process or talk about, or even just have me pray with you online or on the phone, maybe in person if that's possible, about some issue of forgiveness, then by all means be in touch and I'd be happy to do so. But for now, may you know the God of mercy. May you know God's great mercy and love towards you. May you know your sins forgiven, whatever you think those words mean and whatever those things are for you. And may you know peace because of that. Bless you. Take care.